أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu to our viewers and listeners. This is study 23 of the Ramadan Daily Quran studies of the year 2020. I'm Zahid Aziz and I'm delivering these for the MV Anjuman Ishat Islam, Lahore, UK. As I said at the beginning of study 22, we'll discuss this belief in abrogation or naskh over the next few studies, and this is the second part. The use of the word naskh or abrogated by companions of the Holy Prophet about certain verses was sometimes not meant in the sense of abrogation of a verse by a later one, but what was meant was its clarification or explanation. Sometimes it happened during the revelation of the Quran that a verse was revealed and people did not understand some aspect of it and they misinterpreted it. A later verse then clarified its meaning. And this was not, of course, an abrogation of the earlier verse, but it was correction of a certain wrong interpretation of it. But nonetheless, the companions of the Holy Prophet and even later in later centuries, commentators of the Holy Quran also called this naskh, when in fact the earlier verse was simply clarified by the later one and not abrogated. An example of this is at the end of Surah Al-Baqarah chapter 2, verse 284. وَإِن تُبْدُوا مَا فِي أَنفُسِكُمْ وَتُخْفُوهُ يُحَاسِبْكُم بِهِ اللَّهُ, which translates as, and whether you manifest what is in your minds or hide it, Allah will call you to account according to it. Verse 284 of chapter 2. Now, according to a report in Sahih Bukhari, Ibn Umar said that these words were abrogated by the verse which came after it. Now, we may reasonably ask this question: what is there in this verse to be abrogated? There is no command for Muslims to carry out. There is no permission granted to them to do something so that that command or permission could be withdrawn. But it is simply stating what Allah does. Now, what happened was that some companions took these words to mean whether you manifest what is in your minds or hide it. In other words, whether you do something wrong openly, manifest it, or it remains hidden as an intention in your mind. They took it to mean that Allah would punish and hold accountable a person for every bad idea which entered his mind, even if that person entertained that idea only for a moment, and even if it was beyond his control, even if it was not in his control, that the idea entered into his mind. So that was the impression they got. Verse 286, two verses later, corrects any such view, and it begins, La yukallifullahu nafsan illa wus'aha laha ma kasabat wa alayha ma iktasabat. That Allah does not impose on any soul a duty beyond its ability, and to its benefit is the good things that it earns, and to its detriment are the evil things that it works. To control the entering of thoughts into an individual's mind is beyond that person's ability. So he cannot be held to account or punished for such thoughts. And what this verse 286 adds, which says that Allah does not impose on any soul a duty beyond its ability, that, as I've said, it's not within the person's ability to control the entering of thoughts into his mind. But this verse also adds that a person's gain or loss is as a result of his actions, actual actions. Now, this statement of verse 286 is described in Bukhari and elsewhere as well as abrogating verse 284, the one I read at the beginning of this study. But it's only clarifying its true meaning. And in fact, it didn't require this verse 286. It didn't require this verse 286 to correct the misinterpretation of verse 284, because there is a much earlier revelation in the Quran, which, speaking of good people, it describes them as follows. I'll only read the translation. Those who avoid the great sins and indecencies, but the passing idea. Surely your Lord is liberal in forgiving. He knows best when he brings you forth from the earth and when you are embryos in the wombs of your mothers. So do not ascribe purity to yourselves. He knows best who guards against evil. Chapter 53, verse 32, which I think I quoted in another context in another study of this year. Now, this verse clearly says that the passing idea of committing something wrong is forgiven. It's forgiven by Allah. And it goes on to say that God knows the inner nature of a person. God knows that a person is a human being. This is what is meant by having been brought forth from the earth. And God knows that a person has certain what are called genetic predispositions, which are referred to in the words, when you are embryos in the wombs of your mothers. Now, due to these causes, which apply to all human beings, any person is bound to have frailties and weaknesses, and these passing ideas do occur. And this verse adds here that no one should consider himself to be pure and immune from such weaknesses which are inherent within him. So in view of this verse, there was no need to believe that verse 284 of chapter 2 was saying that Allah would punish people for wrong ideas, for ideas of wrongdoing which entered their minds. Anyhow, so the use of this word nask didn't always mean that a verse has abrogated another, but that it has clarified another. But as Maulana Muhammad Ali has noted in his book, The Religion of Islam, and I quote him here, at the same time it is true that the use of this word nask, soon became indiscriminate. And when anyone found himself unable to reconcile two verses of the Quran, he would declare one of them to be abrogated by the other. So rather than trying to see the two verses in the light of each other and reconcile the two of them, they would simply declare one to be abrogated by the other, even, by the way, when they had no knowledge of which came first, which was revealed first. Now, commentators of the Quran and Islamic scholars, without examining whether the concept of abrogation in the Quran was correct or not, took this idea further and even wrote that there were verses which were originally included in the recitation of the Quran, but whose recitation was later abrogated, so that they were not included in the written texts of the Quran. And they themselves went on building on these imaginary foundations. They devised three categories of abrogated verses, building on a completely non-existent foundation. They said there were three categories of abrogated verses. One, verses that were abrogated as regards their recitation and their commands. So the recitation of the verse was abrogated, it's no longer in the Quran, and the command went with it, abrogated. Secondly, verses that were only abrogated as regards their recitation, but their commands remain in force. And thirdly, are the verses which you've been talking about, verses that were abrogated only as regards their commands, but their recitation remains in force. They still remained in the written text of the Quran, but they were abrogated. And this is the conventional view, unfortunately, of mainstream Sunni Muslim scholars. And that view is outlined in that 1981 popular and useful book, I should say, called An Introduction to the Sciences of the Quran by the scholarly Mr. Ahmad van Denver, who himself is a mainstream Sunni Muslim who agrees with this belief in abrogation. And in his book, after listing these three categories, he is given an example of each category. Now, as regards the first two categories, that is to say, existence of verses which were a part of the recitation of the Quran, but whose recitation was later abrogated during the life of the Holy Prophet, so they were never included in the text of the Quran. This suggestion is simply contrary to the history of the recitation and collection of the Quran. Every verse revealed to the Holy Prophet was immediately memorized and recited publicly by so many companions of the Holy Prophet that it would then become impossible to cancel the recitation of any verse and to retract it. And the second category, which these scholars have mentioned, verses abrogated only in words, only for recitation, but whose commands remained in force. This is, I'm sorry to say, complete absurdity. If the command in those alleged verses was meant to remain in force, why abrogate the recitation of the verse conveying the command? It makes no sense. And if the recitation is abrogated, it will be understood by people that any command in it is also abrogated. So this is most bizarre, absurd, and ridiculous, and yet widely accepted. Now we come to the third category, that is to say, verses that are a part of the text of the Quran that we recite in the Holy Quran, that we read in the Holy Quran, but which are considered to be abrogated by other verses. That is, those are the only ones we can discuss practically. And in this study, we've given an example of such a verse considered to be abrogated, and we gave another example earlier in the last study. So that brings to an end study 23, which I hope was clearer on this subject than study 22. Barakallahu lana wa lakum fil Quranil Azim wa nafa'na wa iyyakum bil ayati wal zikril hakim innahu ta'ala jawadun karimun malikun barur raufur rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.